On August 7, 1996, a 41-year-old entrepreneur named Lance Herndon woke up at 3:40 a.m. to the sound of his alarm clock going off inside of his mansion in Roswell, Georgia. The alarm was actually one of 3 alarms set to go off that morning. The first was at 3:40, the second at 3:50, and the third at 4 a.m. And this was actually how every workday began for Lance. He was the founder of an IT consulting company called Access Inc., and his borderline compulsive work ethic not only made him millions of dollars, but also it had made him a trailblazer for the Black business community in Greater Atlanta. His company, Access Inc., had actually been awarded the National Service Firm of the Year award by President George H.W. Bush. President Clinton had honored Lance with the Minority Entrepreneur of the Year award and had appointed him to the 1995 White House Conference on Small Business. Lance sat up and slammed his hand down on the clock to stop the alarm, and then shut off the other 2 alarms so they wouldn't ring. Then he threw aside his bedsheets and got up and walked over to the dresser to pull out some clothes. On top of his dresser, he kept a sexy lingerie photograph of one of his girlfriends, a woman he'd been seeing for years named Kathy Collins. Now, usually, when Lance saw this photograph, he would smile, but today, he flipped it face down so he wouldn't have to look at it. He was going to have to break up with Kathy, and he was not looking forward to it. Lance and Kathy had been on again, off again since they first met 3 years ago. But they'd rekindled things for real about 7 months ago, and she had moved most of her stuff into his house. But for Lance, this progression sort of made the whole thing feel too serious. He sort of preferred to play the field. In fact, at that very moment, he didn't just have this one girlfriend. He had another steady girlfriend, a 27-year-old college student named Dion Baugh, and he was also interested in another woman that he had just met who worked as a school teacher. Plus, he was also still dealing with the fallout from his divorce from his third wife, Janine Herndon, who he had a 4-year-old son with. Lance actually had to keep meticulous notes in his calendar just to keep all of this straight, and it was really starting to wear on him. Plus, in addition to dumping Kathy, something he knew he needed to do soon, he was also considering dumping Dion as well, because she was the jealous type and he just felt like he didn't need the drama. But for now, Lance threw on a shirt and a pair of pants and then headed downstairs into his basement, where he had a full working office set up for his IT company. Every day, Lance's small staff of full-time employees, plus his assistant, came to this basement office to do all their work. But they wouldn't actually arrive here for another 4 hours, which gave Lance plenty of time to get everything ready. Lance sat down at his desk, hit the record button on a small tape recorder, and started dictating detailed lists of instructions for each of his employees. Every morning, he would make these cassette tapes so that when his employees came in, they knew exactly what he wanted them to do, even if he had already gone out for the day, which he was doing more and more lately. When Lance had first started Access Inc., he had pretty much worked exclusively on his business all the time and was never really out of the office. But recently, business had not been going very well, and so Lance's attention was now split between, a growing list of problems and new ventures he was considering. He hadn't told anybody the details, but Access Inc. was in pretty big financial trouble. At its peak, it had been valued at more than $3 million, but now the business was heavily in debt and losing money. Lance had tried to diversify by investing in a hip-hop club in downtown Atlanta, but that had failed, and now he was embroiled in a lawsuit with his former business partner. Add all that to the alimony and child support that Lance was paying to his ex-wife, plus the lavish lifestyles he was funding for his various girlfriends, and for the first time in his life, Lance was starting to worry about whether he could even hold everything together. Lance finished the cassette tapes for his employees and left them on their desks. Then he went back upstairs to get ready for his day. By the time his workers actually started arriving at 8 a.m. through the designated office side door, Lance was already halfway through his list of daily tasks in his calendar. Which meant, by the time the late afternoon rolled around, Lance was free to leave his house, and therefore his office, and go to his mother's house to have dinner. His grandmother, who was visiting from out of town, was going to be at this dinner, along with Lance's ex-wife and their son. But despite wanting to see his family, Lance didn't stay for very long. At around 8 p.m., he told his mother, his grandmother, his ex-wife, and his son that he had to get back to work. Then he said goodbye and drove the 5 minutes back to his house. When Lance pulled back into his driveway, he saw his secretary's light blue car parked in its usual spot, and he smiled. His secretary was a woman named Talana Caraway, and she was one of his closest friends. They had been romantic in the past. In fact, Lance's divorce was caused in part by the fact that his wife had found racy pictures he had of Talana. But now, their relationship was purely platonic, and they both actually confided in each other about their respective love lives. Talana worked another full-time job, so she typically only worked evenings for Lance. Lance went in the office door and found Talana working her way through the list of tasks that he had outlined for her on her cassette tape. Talana was very obviously happy to see him, and for a little while, the two of them just sat there chatting and catching up. Talana was apparently having trouble with her partner, a guy named Jazz, and she complained about him a bit. Lance actually knew Jazz because he had lent him some money, and he nodded sympathetically. Lance told Talana that he was actually hoping for a fresh start in the romance department, because he had another new woman, but this one he was really interested in. He said she was a teacher and she was really nice, and he asked Talana if she would help him write her a card. And like he knew she would, Talana just laughed. Like, the idea that the ex-girlfriend is now writing a card for the new girlfriend was just kind of comical to her. But this was actually one of the things that Lance really liked best about Talana, and it's why their relationship continued to flourish. She was just easygoing, unlike his various current girlfriends. And so Talana, without any hesitation, helped write the card, and then Lance signed it. As Lance stood up to head upstairs, Talana gestured for him to wait. Then she handed him a couple slips of paper. She said they were messages from his girlfriend Dion, who had called for him a couple of times while he was out. At this, Lance groaned. Dion was a lot to deal with. A month earlier, she'd shown up at his house unannounced while Kathy was over. Dion had seen Kathy through the window, and she had made such a scene that Lance actually had to call the police. She actually had a court hearing about that incident tomorrow that Lance was supposed to go to. Lance thanked Talana for the messages, and then he went upstairs to his bedroom to begin moving Kathy's things out of his closet. About 2.5 hours later, at around 10:30 p.m., Talana came upstairs and told Lance she'd see him tomorrow. It was raining, so Lance made her promise to call him when she got home so he knew she was safe. And she would do that around 11:30 p.m., and they actually chatted for another few minutes on the phone. But at some point, Lance told Talana goodnight. He could have talked to her for hours, but he knew that he didn't have long before his morning alarms would start going off. The next morning, August 8th, at exactly 8 a.m., one of Lance's employees arrived at his house and unlocked the side office door. And the first thing she noticed when she stepped inside was that Lance was not there. This was weird because even on days where Lance left early, he was usually at his desk first thing in the morning. But the employee figured that maybe Lance had an appointment. So she went over to his calendar to check to see where he was, but, sort of atypical for him, there was nothing listed for that day. That was when she noticed the second thing, which was that Lance had not left her a cassette tape for the day. And this was not just weird, it was completely unprecedented. Lance had literally never not left her a tape. And so the employee paged Lance, but he didn't answer. So, unsure what else to do, the employee just sat down and started to work. About an hour later, at 9 a.m., another employee arrived, but there was still no sign of Lance. The two employees paged him a few more times, but he still didn't answer. And even though both of them considered going upstairs and just checking on him, neither of them felt comfortable doing that. After all, the upstairs was Lance's house. It just felt like an invasion of privacy. Finally, at 10 a.m., so 2 hours after that first employee arrived, Lance's mother, who also worked at Access Inc., arrived at her son's house. She had come in through the garage, and when she entered the office and the employees told her that Lance was still not there, she said that didn't make any sense because his car was in the garage. So, the two employees waited in the office while Lance's mother went up to search the house. And for a few minutes, the two employees down in the basement heard nothing. The house was quiet. They could just hear the sound of Lance's mother walking around upstairs. But then, out of nowhere, they heard a scream. About 30 minutes later, around 10:30 a.m., Roswell police detective William Anastasio pulled up in front of a mansion that sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in a wealthy community in suburban Georgia. The only thing dispatch had told him was that someone inside of this mansion had been killed. Outside of the mansion, he could see there were police cruisers and ambulances on the street, and his sergeant and a few other investigators were standing in a cluster right near the front door. He walked over to them, and the sergeant briefed him on what they knew so far. The homeowner, Lance Herndon, had been found dead inside of his bed by his own mother after he had failed to show up for work in his basement office. There were no signs of forced entry, and the crime scene itself appeared to be contained to the master bedroom. Lance's employees had discovered that the office laptop was missing, but the rest of the house was filled with expensive electronics and jewelry that had not been touched. The sergeant told Anastasio that uniformed officers were already canvassing the neighborhood and that Anastasio should take the lead in the investigation. So Anastasio turned and walked inside the house and began going up the stairs to the master bedroom. Outside the door to the bedroom, there was a uniformed officer whose job was to make sure nobody touched anything before the crime scene techs arrived. And so Anastasio greeted him and told him he understood the protocol, but then he just stood there outside the doorway, not interfering, but looking inside, getting a first glimpse of the actual crime scene. He could see Lance's body on the bed. Lance was on his back, with his arms crossed over his chest, and he was naked. Even from a distance, Anastasio could see that whoever had killed Lance had beaten him so badly in the face that his facial bones had basically collapsed inwards. It was like someone truly bashed his head in. But strangely, despite this, it didn't seem like there had been any sort of struggle in this room. I mean, typically with a beating death, there was often a big fight between the victim and the assailant, which can create a very messy scene with furniture knocked over and everything messed around inside the room. But from the looks of it, it didn't seem like Lance had fought back at all. Like nothing was knocked over. He was just laying there on his back on the bed with his head caved in. And reinforcing the idea that this was not about money, Anastasio could clearly see on the dresser next to the body was a wallet, a stack of credit cards, and a folded up wad of cash. And so despite the one missing laptop, this didn't really appear to be a robbery. And so as Anastasio went back down the stairs towards the office he had been told was located in the basement, he was thinking to himself that Lance must have known his killer. This had to have been personal. In the basement office, Anastasio found a police officer standing with a small cluster of very shocked-looking women. One was Lance's grandmother, another was Lance's mother, and the other two were employees of Lance's company. Anastasio spoke with each of them one by one, and Lance's family, their general impression was they had no idea who would want to hurt Lance. Lance's mother told Anastasio that, Lance had just gone through a divorce, which could create some animosity, but he and his ex-wife had stayed on good terms, and in fact, just the night before, had had dinner together. Lance's grandmother echoed a similar sentiment that, Lance was this harmless guy, but she also had Alzheimer's and so couldn't really answer any of the questions, at least not credibly. The other two women, the employees of Lance's company, they told a slightly different story to Anastasio. They said there had been some, quote, shady people in the office recently, but when he pressed them for specifics, they said all they knew was that Lance was involved in some business disputes. Just then, a uniformed officer opened the basement door and told Anastasio he'd better get outside. The detective jogged outside, and there, at the foot of the long driveway, he saw a woman sitting in a car. The uniformed officer told him that was Lance's ex-wife, Janine. This was not what Anastasio had expected, and he would have preferred to talk to the ex-wife under more controlled circumstances, not suddenly at the crime scene. But it was also an opportunity, because it was very likely that Anastasio would be the first person to tell her that Lance was dead. And in a murder case, the ex-spouse is always a suspect, and so Anastasio wanted to see how Janine reacted to the news of her ex-husband's murder. So he walked down to her car, and as he did, Janine got out of the car looking panicked, and she told him that someone in the house had paged her. She asked what was going on, but Anastasio, without saying anything, just gestured for her to come with him to his cruiser. Once they were seated inside, he broke the news. And as he did, he carefully watched her. And Janine looked genuinely shocked. She opened and then closed her mouth like she couldn't even think of what to say, and then her eyes filled with tears. And then, in a trembling voice, she asked Anastasio what happened. But Anastasio was not ready to share anything at this point. So instead, he just asked Janine where she had been last night, and then waited to see if she got defensive or started stuttering. But she didn't do either of those things. She took a deep breath, and then told him she had actually had dinner with Lance and his family the night before, and then after that, she went home. Her new partner had come over and spent the night with her, and then that morning, she'd gotten up at 7 a.m. to head to her side job as a house cleaner, and then of course at about 10:30 she'd received that page, and here she was. And that detail, that the ex-wife of an obviously very wealthy man was working as a cleaner, caught Anastasio's attention. He wondered if she'd still be working as a cleaner after she received whatever life insurance payout he was certain was going to come her way. But before he could ask her anything about her finances or her job, Janine blurted something out. She said, "My husband was a powerful man with a lot of enemies." By the time Detective Anastasio finished his conversation with Janine, he had gone from having 0 suspects to having 6. There was Janine herself, of course, but Anastasio had been surprised to learn that Lance had been seriously dating at least 2 other women, Kathy Collins and Dion Baugh, and that his secretary, Talana Caraway, was also a former girlfriend. This meant that Janine, Kathy, Dion, and Talana all had potential motives to want Lance dead. But Janine had actually been much more focused on the men who hated Lance. She said that Lance had always talked about business rivals being jealous of his success. And recently, he'd become embroiled in at least 2 lawsuits that Janine knew of, one with a former business partner over a hip-hop club, and the other with a contractor who said he hadn't been paid yet. Janine had heard that just yesterday, that contractor had actually shown up to a local music show looking for Lance. And when he couldn't find him, apparently he was telling people that, Lance didn't know what he was capable of, as if the contractor could, inflict harm on Lance if he didn't pay him. Anastasio was not quite sure what to think about any of this, except that he was definitely going to need a lot of DNA samples. That afternoon, Anastasio was back inside of the house, working alongside the crime scene techs who had finally arrived at about noon. And while he was doing that, 2 other women showed up at the crime scene. One of the women was Lance's secretary and former girlfriend, Talana Calloway. She said she had seen Lance the night before, and that one of his girlfriends, Dion, had kept calling for him over and over and kept leaving increasingly upset messages when he didn't answer. And these messages, Talana was fielding, and she gave them to Lance when he finally did come home. The other woman who was there with Talana was Lance's other girlfriend, Kathy Collins. But unlike Janine and Talana, Kathy didn't even try to act like she wanted to help with this investigation. Instead, she demanded to be let inside the house to go get her clothes. The uniformed officers on the scene told her that she couldn't do that because this was a crime scene, but Kathy didn't seem to care at all. And so the officers took down her name and contact info, and they also made a note that Kathy had not shed a single tear. Early the next morning, Detective Anastasio went to the medical examiner's office to observe the autopsy. He'd been at the crime scene until late, and once the crime scene techs processed everything, he'd gotten a closer look at the physical evidence, and a couple things had stood out to him. First, Lance had 3 alarm clocks, and all of them had been unplugged. And one of the alarm clocks was an analog clock, and when it was unplugged, it stopped at whatever time it was, which in this case was 4:10 a.m. And so, it was theoretically possible that perhaps the clocks began going off while the killer was still inside the house, and so they rushed over and unplugged the clocks to stop the alarm, which then put the likely time of death at or sometime before 4:10 in the morning on August 8th. Second, on the dresser, there was a framed photograph of a woman in lingerie that had been turned face down. The picture appeared to be deliberately flipped, not knocked over, as if whoever had flipped it didn't want to look at this picture. And third, inside of Lance's bedsheets were several pieces of long hair that clearly belonged to more than one woman, and there were also some short hairs as well. Now, Anastasio and the medical examiner both looked down at Lance's body. He'd apparently been hit at least 7 times in the face, with something long, heavy, and curved at the end. The medical examiner had seen wounds like this once before and thought the murder weapon could be a wrench. However, there was not a single defensive wound on Lance. He clearly had not raised his hands to stop any of the blows that his killer had rained down on him. That, combined with the fact that he'd been found naked in bed with no signs of struggle around him, suggested to Anastasio that the attack had begun when Lance was asleep. The medical examiner said that, judging from the locations of the blows and the blood spatter that he'd seen at the crime scene, the killer had likely climbed on top of Lance before they beat him to death. And this was very significant to Anastasio. On his list of suspects, he had female romantic partners and male business rivals. But whoever had killed Lance had not had to break into the house because Lance had clearly let them in, and also Lance felt comfortable enough with them to go to sleep naked near them. Then, to commit the murder, the killer had straddled Lance's chest, which was a very intimate position. And so to Anastasio, these details all combined suggested that his killer was a woman. When Detective Anastasio got back to the station, he claimed the single interview room inside the Roswell Police headquarters and began doing interviews. He had a forensics person standing by to get hair samples and fingerprints from all his subjects to match against the crime scene. Anastasio spoke again to Lance's mother, also his ex-wife Janine, and those 2 employees who had been at the house when the body was found. And he took all their DNA. Anastasio didn't really suspect the mother or the employees, but he did have a feeling about Janine. Janine was cooperating, but she would stay on his list until he could definitively nail down her alibi and take a look at her financials. Next up was Kathy Collins, one of Lance's girlfriends who had shown up at the crime scene totally distraught about her clothing. And the moment she sat down in the chair in the interview room, Anastasio recognized her as the woman in that downturned photograph on Lance's dresser. And when Anastasio began asking questions, he sort of half expected her to again ask about her clothes. But instead, Kathy laid out what Anastasio had to admit was a pretty good alibi. Kathy said she had been out of town at a family funeral and had arrived back in Roswell on August 7th in the evening along with her niece. She and her niece had gotten dinner at a restaurant close to Lance's house and had stayed there until about maybe 10:30 or 11 p.m. She then gave Anastasio a receipt from a gas station that was in another state, along with the tab from the restaurant to back these details up. Although Anastasio noted that she and her niece had only eaten $7 worth of food, which seemed very light for how long they had been there. However, Anastasio knew that, Lance was not killed while Kathy and her niece were allegedly at this restaurant on August 7th. Instead, he was very likely killed in the early morning hours of August 8th, likely around 4:10 a.m. But Kathy said, she had spent the entire night on August 7th into August 8th with her other romantic partner. She said that she and Lance had never really been all that monogamous. In fact, when they met, both of them were married. So when Anastasio asked Kathy if it was possible that Lance might have been thinking about breaking up with her, she just shrugged and said they really weren't that close anymore. She told Anastasio she'd be happy to provide DNA samples and fingerprints because she didn't kill him. Before she got up to leave, Kathy told Anastasio there was one more thing. She said about a month earlier, some woman had come to Lance's home in the middle of the night, freaking out so loudly that Lance had actually called the police. If the police were thinking one of Lance's girlfriends killed him, Kathy said they should start by finding that woman. When the door closed behind Kathy, Anastasio smiled, because a record search had already turned up the police report for the incident Kathy was talking about. And that woman, the girlfriend, was Dion Baugh, who was already on her way down to the station. When Dion arrived, she took a seat inside the interview room, and right away, Anastasio began drilling her with questions. And immediately, he was suspicious. First of all, Dion's demeanor was very strange. She kept giggling every time she was asked a question. Now, Anastasio knew that likely she was just nervous, and so that by itself was not proof of guilt, but it certainly didn't help her credibility. Second, Dion herself was carrying on multiple romantic relationships, just like Lance. And third, perhaps the most suspicious out of all of it, Dion admitted right up front that she had Lance's missing laptop, as well as one of his credit cards. And in fact, she had charged $2,700 worth of furniture on it the same night that Lance was murdered. Suddenly, Dion Baugh was Anastasio's number one suspect. And so the detective leaned forward in his chair and asked Dion where she'd been from the evening of August 7th to the morning of August 8th. And her alibi was very weak. She said she had been at home, without her husband or her daughter, who were visiting family. In fact, Dion said there was no one who could confirm this for her. But Dion insisted that she hadn't murdered Lance. She said that Lance did a lot of good stuff for her. He had bought her a beautiful Mercedes car, and he gave her hundreds of dollars in cash every week, plus the use of his credit cards. And then she asked the detective, why would she be so stupid as to make a giant purchase with one of those credit cards on the same night that he was killed? It would be so suspicious. She also said he lent her his laptop all the time for school, and any of his employees could confirm that. Dion said that on August 7th, she had called Lance repeatedly, but he never answered. And then on August 8th, the day his body was found, he was supposed to go with her to court to help her clear the charge she had picked up on the night a month earlier when he had called the cops on her for coming to his home acting crazy. But he hadn't shown up in court. She said she'd been so angry and called him repeatedly throughout the day to see why he blew her off, but he never answered on the 8th. Of course, she said now she knew why. It was because he was dead. Dion offered Anastasio her phone records. She said she would give DNA samples and her fingerprints. And then she told him she really hoped he solved the case soon because she was afraid. She said that Lance was always paying people to do his dirty work, and until detectives caught his killer, she was going to be looking over her shoulder, in case maybe they came for her too. Anastasio would spend the next couple of weeks trying to run down the alibis of every single person and their significant others who might have wanted Lance Herndon dead. It was a long list. Some people the detective did feel ready to rule out. Lance's ex-wife, Janine Herndon, for example, had a solid alibi confirmed by her new partner. And although she would have been the recipient, along with her son, of Lance's life insurance policy, she was already receiving a good amount of money from Lance monthly in the form of alimony and child support. And so Lance was worth more to her alive than dead. And then there were Lance's various business rivals, and they turned out to be very weak suspects, primarily because they all had alibis. Plus, it just seemed very unlikely that Lance would have, let these business rivals into his home late at night without some sort of confrontation. But as the investigation wore on, other suspects who Anastasio had also been ready to write off started behaving in ways that made them look more suspicious, not less. Kathy Collins, for example, who was really bent out of shape about not getting her clothes back, had supplied a more or less rock-solid alibi, plus DNA and fingerprints. But 6 days after the murder, she had sent a demand letter to the police station listing off every item she had left inside of Lance's home, down to her sunglasses, perfume, and a bottle of wine, asking for all of it back immediately. It was an outrageously cold move from somebody who should have been at least a little sad about Lance's death. And then there was Talana Caraway, the girlfriend turned secretary/platonic friend. On the day Lance's body was found, she had come to Lance's home because she said she wanted to help. That action could be viewed either as proof that she had nothing to hide, or as inserting herself into the investigation and offering distractions from her own guilt. And after that first day, when she'd been so willing to talk and cooperate, now she had clammed up. Another detective on Anastasio's team had gone to her house to ask some follow-up questions, and she had refused to come to the door at all. Then she'd shown up at the police station with her own lawyer. And that wasn't all. The only thing police had learned during their canvass of the neighborhood on the first day of the investigation was that apparently somebody had been spotted driving through the neighborhood in a light blue car at about 4:40 a.m. This timeline matched up with the ballpark time of death of 4:10 a.m., and the vehicle description matched Talana's own car. However, apparently people thought they saw a man driving that car at 4:40 a.m. And so after learning this, Anastasio did some digging, and he discovered that Talana's partner, Jazz, owed Lance money, and that Jazz had a criminal record. And so while Anastasio doubted that Jazz could have on his own just walked his way into Lance's house, he did think it was quite possible that Talana could get inside and then maybe open the door for Jazz. Finally, there was Dion Baugh, the woman who had shown up at Lance's house and acted crazy and had police called on her. Of all of Lance's girlfriends, her alibi was absolutely the weakest, and her level of anger and outrage at Lance was definitely the highest. Also, she literally had Lance's missing computer and one of his credit cards. But as the days ticked by, Anastasia was realizing that none of the details surrounding Dion were smoking guns. Dion's phone records confirmed her story about making repeated calls to Lance, and Lance's other employees confirmed that Dion did sometimes borrow his laptop. That was normal. And Lance's banking information showed that throughout his entire relationship with Dion, he spent tons of money on her. And so the idea that she would buy, $2,700 of furniture on the night of his murder looked suspicious, but actually appeared to be pretty typical. Dion had willingly given DNA and fingerprints, and the police had matched 3 of the hairs found in Lance's bed to Dion, but they'd also found 13 other hairs that didn't belong to Dion, Lance, or any of the other women they knew Lance had slept with. And since Dion had already admitted to sleeping with Lance in his bed not long before the murder, the hairs really weren't proof of anything Anastasio didn't already know. Detective Anastasio still didn't have the murder weapon either. Now, the medical examiner had guessed that Lance was killed with a wrench, and after interviewing Lance's housekeeper, police had discovered that a wrench was missing from Lance's home. But a missing murder weapon couldn't give any fingerprints. And so far, none of the women that Anastasio had collected prints from had matched prints found in Lance's bedroom. And so within about a month of Lance's murder, the case that had seemed so hot on that first day was now going cold. More than a year would pass, and in that time, Detective Anastasio would continue to investigate Lance Herndon's murder, but he really didn't make any progress. He stayed in touch with the prosecutor, with both of them hoping that some new lead would turn up, but all their evidence had gotten them nowhere. And so between business rivals, romantic partners, and romantic partners' significant others, it felt like this murder could have plausibly been committed by at least 10 different people. That was until January of 1998, when the prosecutor who had been working with Anastasio got a phone call. And on this call, the caller told them that Lance's killer was currently involved in a heated divorce case. And during arguments for that case, the killer had destroyed their own alibi for the night of Lance's murder. Now, it had been 17 months at this point since Lance had been killed, but the prosecutor was still skeptical that the killer would really be so sloppy as to present evidence to a different court that went against what they'd already told local police. But then, later that month, the prosecutor went to the divorce trial to watch for himself, and there, everything came together. Based on evidence and interviews conducted during an investigation that spanned a year and a half, this is what police believe happened to Lance Herndon in the early morning hours of August 8, 1996. The killer lay in bed next to Lance, listening to him breathe. And as they did, a feeling of rage grew in the killer's chest. Lance was just lying there, peacefully sleeping, with no care in the world for how badly he was hurting the killer. Lance didn't know that the killer knew he had lied to them. Lance had fallen asleep thinking that he had the killer fooled, but Lance was wrong, and the killer couldn't stand it any longer. And so they slipped out of bed and headed downstairs, where they retrieved the wrench they had seen on a countertop earlier. Then, with the weapon in hand, they went back into the master bedroom, got back in bed, and climbed right on top of Lance, straddling him. Then, while Lance slept peacefully right in front of them, the killer raised the wrench up and then brought it down on his face so hard that Lance was instantly knocked unconscious. And so Lance did nothing as the killer repeatedly smashed the wrench into Lance's face over and over again until his skull literally caved in and Lance was dead. After the frenzy, the killer climbed off of Lance and cleaned themselves up. Lance's alarm clocks began going off and the killer panicked and just unplugged them all. Then they put back on their clothes and hurried downstairs. But the killer did not leave right away. Instead, they first went down to Lance's home office and made sure to take his laptop computer with them, something they had checked before they decided to kill him. Because the killer was Dion Baugh, one of Lance's many girlfriends. And one thing inside of that laptop helped explain her motive. It was Lance's daily calendar, which he had always updated so meticulously to keep his appointments and his girlfriends straight. But officials said Dion killed Lance in part because of the one thing he had not put into his calendar, which was her court appearance, scheduled for the morning of August 8th. Lance had promised to go to court with her on that day to help her clear the charge she'd picked up for coming to his home in the middle of the night a month earlier. But Lance's calendar for August 8th was completely empty. Lance had no intention of going, and Dion knew it. To Dion, this was an unforgivable betrayal, and so she bludgeoned Lance to death. Dion ultimately incriminated herself during her divorce trial by telling the court she had actually gone to Lance's house on August 7th, hours before he was killed. Remember, she had told police at the time that she had not done that and she was home alone the whole time, was never at his house. And so when the prosecutor who sat in on the divorce trial actually heard her testimony, which directly contradicted her alibi that she had given, he had her arrested as soon as she left the courthouse. Ultimately, Dion pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She was released in 2011. In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his two daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So Frank's wife and the girl's mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible, but what made it even worse is that, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household. And so as soon as she passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job, again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these two poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, you gotta remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. They can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, putting themselves to bed, they start talking about how, man, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there is a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a game board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a planchette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer, that you can place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the planchette. And they will literally just say things like, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, the spirits will move the planchette around so that people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it. And it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board. They go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers on the planchette. And after a minute, one of the girls is like, hey, Mom, are you here with us right now? And they have their fingers on the planchette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute, and they try again. Mom, if you're here with us right now, please, anything, just move it even a little bit. Show us you're here with us right now. Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question they can possibly think of to try to elicit a response from their mother, who they so want to believe is like with them right now, sort of looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they asked these questions, the planchette never moved. So the seance didn't work. And so the girls, it's not clear if they literally believed they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom. But, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, mom really is gone. And so they packed up their Ouija board, very frustrated, and they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house. They climb into bed, and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work. He won't be home for some time, and the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep. And so they're laying in their bedrooms. It's totally dark. It's quiet. And as they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But, at first, the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. It just sort of sounded like, house sounds at night. The sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what, but they seem sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, it wasn't really consistent tapping sound, it was more sporadic, but it was consistently sporadic, like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. As that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering, like, what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out. And so she got out of her bed and she left her room. She goes down the hallway. She comes into Tina's bedroom and she goes up to her big sister and she's like, "Do you hear that tapping sound?" And Tina's like, "Yeah, what is that?" And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together. They go out into the hallway. They can still hear the tapping. It's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere. And the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor. They can only see, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there. And the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. And at some point, one of the girls says, "Wait a minute. What if this tapping sound is Mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her?" And so feeling sort of excited all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, "Mom, is that you down there?" And immediately there's a response. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question. And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom. And so after getting that tap, tap, tap response, one of the girls asks another question. "Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you." Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs. And the girls 100% believe it's their mother. And again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom. And even though some of their questions weren't really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response. Like, again, something is interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor and they're hearing this tapping and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. And they open up the basement door and they're asking more questions. They're getting those tap responses and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be Mom, they weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement to follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be Mom, but it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stayed there right above the stairs, looking into the basement, just constantly asking questions and getting responses from down in the basement from Mom. It was great. And eventually, after, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping just stopped. The girls continued asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside and he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is, he's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, "Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had this seance and we heard this tapping sound and we know it was Mom. Mom is with us right now. We were talking to her." Now, Frank, he's totally caught off guard by what they're saying, but he also knows his girls, they're going through this horrible time in their lives. They've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. He's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited, and they're telling him that tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all this stuff, he just goes, "You know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She will always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house, I'm sure of it." And so the girls, they're so happy. Again, this was such an amazing experience. Their dad, he also agreed this is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms, and they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it. Again, he's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. And he thinks, you know what? It's healthy enough. It's making them happy. What's the big deal? So Frank, he goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue, and they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen, they were coming sometimes from the second floor, they were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Like every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over, but Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all. But he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy, clearly this is their coping mechanism. And so again, Frank's not thinking much of it. It's harmless. The girls are frustrated that he can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is mom. This is positive. This was definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping. Because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets, and it was frightening. And they would call their dad in and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's mom anymore. They don't know what this is. And it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. Like it's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls like, hey, come on guys, there's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. Like there's nothing that's going to harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here looking out for you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You got to let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, like, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit. And now that evil spirit is haunting our house. And so Frank, at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. Like, these tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds and Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so fast forward about a week after the seance, and now the girls really are so scared to be in their house because of this tapping, which they believe is now this evil spirit in their house. They're finding all sorts of excuses to just stay out of their house. Like when dad's at work late, they're trying to stay at their friend's house and not be home because it was too frightening. And Frank, he's sort of at his wit's end with what to do with his girls because now this thing that's going on in the house, this delusion as he believed it was, that his girls were suffering from, it was really disruptive and unhealthy. And he began telling his girls, like, if you can't stop with this whole tapping delusion, you're going to have to go to grief counseling. Like, this is too much. And so, again, fast forward about a week here, and that's what's going on in the Bowen household. And on this particular day, the girls, Tina and Karen, they didn't have a place to go that night. They didn't have a friend who was available. And so they're home at their house alone. Frank's out for the night doing a late night shift. And the girls, they're in their kitchen just kind of hanging out. They're pretty anxious here. And they start to hear tapping sounds coming from the basement. Now, by this point, the tapping sounds were so common that just hearing the tapping sounds was not like this horribly frightening thing. It was just sort of this very unsettling thing where nobody knew what they were. And again, the girls think it's something evil. But on this night that the girls are alone, dad's gone, Tina, the older of the two, she says to Karen, like, Dad doesn't believe us. He does not believe that there's tapping sounds in the house. And so we, right now, need to go down in the basement and investigate. Because if we don't, no one's ever going to look into this. Like, nobody believes us.
And Karen is horrified at the idea, Karen's the 9-year-old, of going down into the basement, to go see what this tapping is, but she doesn't want to be away from her sister, and so she's like, okay. And so Tina gets a knife from the kitchen, she goes to the door to the basement, Karen follows right behind her, and Tina, she opens up the door, and the two girls begin going down the steps. And once they get to the bottom of the steps and they're in the basement, it's just this kind of blank slate down there. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's some boxes, but it's just sort of a dank, sort of open, nothing cellar down there. And the girls, when they got down there, they're looking for the origin of this tapping sound. And on some level, they expected to find something that was making these sounds because they've been hearing these sounds. For them, it's not a delusion. Like every time they hear these sounds, they are real to them. Just because their dad doesn't hear it does not mean it's not real to them. And if you look at the beginning, when they first started hearing the sounds, they thought it was their mom. And they never really fully investigated. They maybe didn't want to find out that, perhaps the tapping sound was a washing machine or something, because that would destroy the illusion that it was their mom. So they never fully investigated then, and then the next few days after that, when it sort of transitioned and became a scary thing, the girls also never really investigated because it was scary now. They didn't want to know what was making this tapping sound. And so now here we are a week into this, and they've gone down into the basement where they've heard the tapping sounds, and they're like prepared to see something that is making this sound because it's real for them. Like maybe it's a raccoon or some animal that's gotten into their house. There has to be something because they hear these sounds. But now they're looking around this basement and there's nothing. There's nothing that could possibly be making this sound, and the girls are horrified. And so after being down there only for a couple of minutes, Tina, who's got the kitchen knife, she's like, Karen, let's get out of here. Like, this isn't right. Let's get out of here. And so the girls turn around and they begin going back up the steps. And as they do, they notice something on the stairway wall that they didn't see on the way down. Written in red on the wall are the words, "I'm in your closet, come find me." And when the girls see that, they are horrified. And they sprint up the stairs, they bolt out of their house, they go to their neighbor's house, start banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbor comes to the door and he's like, "What's going on?" And the girls are like, "Oh my God, we had this seance, we've been hearing tapping in the walls, and now somebody's written on the walls, we don't know what's going on." And the neighbor is so confused, really doesn't understand what's happening. And he's like, "Look, girls, just come into my house, you're safe here, we'll wait for your dad to come home, he'll know what to do." And so the girls, they're hysterical, they go into the neighbor's house, they shut the door, and they wait. And then a little bit later, Frank Bowen, their dad, he comes home. The neighbor immediately flags him down and calls him over. And he's like, "Look, here's what happened. Your girls came over. They said, something about writing on the walls. I don't know." And Frank's like, "Okay, all right." And he tells his girls, like, "Look, stay here. You're safe here. I'll go check the house and make sure nobody's in there." Frank at this point in no way suspects that there's anything, evil or bad in his house. He thinks this is just a continuation of this delusion the girls are sort of acting out. And so Frank, alone, goes back to his house. He opens up the door, he goes inside, he searches the house, and he looks everywhere, but there's nobody in the house. He does find the writing in the stairwell going down to the basement. It does say, "I'm in your closet, come find me," but it's written in ketchup. And so after, again, searching the whole house and finding nothing other than this writing, Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and he talks to his girls, and he's not mad at them. In some ways, he feels like all of this is basically his fault. Like, he should have handled this more aggressively at the beginning, and he let it get to this point. And so he tells his girls, like, "Look, I know that you wrote those words on the wall. I know that all of this is sort of a delusion that's playing out that started with, something good. You thought it was mom, but now it's become something that isn't good. It's disruptive. You've convinced yourself the house is haunted. And I'm very worried that this is a product of grief. Like, grief is leading you to do these things, and it needs to stop. And so starting tomorrow, you're going to go into grief counseling. We need professional help here to make sure you girls are taken care of. I should have done this from the beginning, so we're going to make that happen right now." Now, the girls knew they didn't write that on the wall. They're not making the tapping sounds, but they also knew their dad 100% didn't believe them, like zero, and it was not going to change. And on some level, like, they think maybe there's truth to what he's saying. Maybe they are so grief-stricken that they've convinced themselves of things that are not real. And so in this sort of vulnerable moment where the girls are totally upset about what they've seen and what they've heard, they just tell their dad, like, "Fine, like, whatever, we'll go to grief counseling." And so sure enough, the next day, the girls would start grief counseling, and right away, all the tapping in the house, all the writing on the walls, all that stuff stopped. Like peace returned to the Bowen household, at least at first. Fast forward 3 weeks to December 8th, 1986. So this is 3 weeks after the girls began their therapy, and in those 3 weeks, the Bowen household is totally calm, there's no more tapping, nothing, everything is fine. But on December 8th, Frank, along with his 2 girls, Tina and Karen, and their friend, Kathleen, they had been out for the evening, maybe getting ice cream or going out to eat or whatever, and they come back to the Bowen household. And when they do, it's nighttime, so it's dark outside, and Frank, he goes up to the porch, he goes to the front door, and as he's about to open up the door, he looks through one of the windows of his house, and he sees there are several lights on in the house that he didn't remember leaving on before they left. And so he just thinks, like, that's weird. Like, I could have sworn I turned those lights off. He's kind of looking back at the girls right behind him, sort of wondering if maybe they left the lights on, but he's like, oh, that's weird. So he unlocks the front door, he swings the door open, and immediately he sees this scene inside of his house that makes no sense. The TV is on, a radio is on, and furniture in the first floor of the house where he's looking has clearly been moved. Not dramatically, but things have been moved around on the first floor. Like if you live somewhere, you know where things go. Things are off. And Frank, like he's seeing this, and he's sort of looking back at Tina and Karen. He's like, did they do this? Are we back to this whole delusion? You gotta remember that even though it's been 3 weeks now of peace in the Bowen household, Frank is all too aware of how insane it was right before then. With the girls, writing on the wall, at least according to him, and thinking there was an evil spirit in their house. And, he's thinking, is this them? Like, somehow did they do this? This feels sort of like a continuation of that. And he's looking at the girls, but he's thinking to himself, like, they've been with me. We've been out of the house. How could they do this? But again, Frank is sort of caught. On the one hand, he knows this could be his girls, but he's also thinking that's not possible. And so in that mind state of sort of being caught between these two opposing ideas, Frank, instead of backing out of the house and calling the police like anybody else would do, he instead just begins like walking into the house, sort of nonchalant, like not really sure how to react. And he begins this sort of half-cocked search through the house. And the whole time, Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, they see what's going on, and the 2 daughters, they're terrified. I mean, they're all too aware of all the tapping and the writing on the walls. They're thinking, this is real, it's happening again. And so they're tucked up right behind Frank, who again, Frank is like in shock. He's just like wandering through the house, like, what's going on here? Turns the TV off, he's walking around, turns the radio off, he's moving furniture back around, and he can't believe it. And so he does this weird, like again, half-invested search through the first floor. He doesn't find anybody there. He goes to the second floor, does the same search. Again, all 3 girls, the 2 daughters and the friend, they're right behind Frank because they're so scared. They do the search of the second floor, nobody there. They search the attic, nobody there either. They go down to the basement, nobody in the basement, like there's nobody in the house. And so Frank is like, what is going on here? And then he remembers there's actually a room on the first floor of the house that he forgot to search. It was just a front room of the house right off the front entrance. When he began the search, he just sort of overlooked it because he was sort of in a daze. And so he's like, okay, I'll go back up there and I'll search that last room and then I'll know the whole house is secure. Nobody's here. And so Frank goes back up the basement stairs to the first floor. The girls are tucked up right behind him, still so scared. And he makes his way towards this room, and this room overlooks the front of the property. There are windows looking out to the road. It's just you walk in, there's windows, there's the front of the house, and there's a little closet over to the left. It's like a sitting room. And so Frank, he goes into this room, and right away, he sees on the wall right in front of him, written in shaving cream, are the words, "Marry me." And so Frank, he walks over to the words, and he's staring at them, being like, what is this? Like, who wrote this? The girls, again, are right behind him, tucked up against the back of his legs, and he's staring, and as he's doing that, he hears movement in the closet in the room that he's in. And Frank turns and he looks at this closet. The doors are open to this closet, but it's a dark closet. And out of the closet walks a man who was wearing a dress, Frank's dead wife's dress. This person had clown makeup on their face, and they were wielding a hatchet. And they walk out of the closet, and they look at Frank, and they look at the girls who are so shocked, they're just in silence staring back at the sky. And this person looks at Frank and goes, you and the girls go upstairs. And so Frank immediately goes into protector mode, and he gets between the maniac and his girls, and he just tells the girls, like, go up the stairs, do what he says. And the hatchet-wielding maniac just sort of walks along, following after Frank and the girls. Again, Frank sort of staying between this person and the girls. And so Frank shepherds the girls up the stairs, and he's like, go ahead, girls, first bedroom, go in the first bedroom. So they go upstairs. All three girls go into the first bedroom. So Kathleen, Karen, Tina, and then Frank, he goes into the bedroom, and the maniac's right here in the hallway about to follow after Frank. And as soon as Frank gets in the door, Frank shuts the door and holds it shut, and there's suddenly this struggle between the maniac in the hallway and Frank. The maniac's trying to get in, there's this vicious struggle, and Tina, who's already in this bedroom, just turns, runs, and leaps out the second floor window. And so she smashes to the ground, she runs next door to that neighbor's house, she slams on the door, the neighbor comes out and Tina's screaming about, there's someone in my house! And so the neighbor at this point knows this is a real emergency, they call the police, and then minutes later, the police show up, and when they get there, they look up at the Bowen household, and Frank Bowen is leaning out of that second floor bedroom, and he's screaming to the police, hey, there's somebody in here, he was just at my door, he's gone, I don't know where he is! And police, they get over, they put a ladder up to the window, Frank comes down, they get the other two girls down, so everybody is safely out of the house now. They've been moved over to that neighbor's house, and now the police are going to go into the Bowen household to find this dress-wearing, hatchet-wielding, clown makeup-wearing maniac. They're going to find him and put him into custody. And so the police, they go into the Bowen household, guns drawn, and they search that entire property, top to bottom, and they find nothing. Nobody's there. The house is completely vacant. However, they would find a hatchet lying by the back sliding glass door, and the back sliding glass door was partially open. And so ultimately, again, when nobody is found inside the house, the police decide, well, clearly this maniac, if there really was a maniac, is now gone. Because look, the door's open, the hatchet's here, so they're gone. And so the police, they go over and talk to Frank and his family, and they're like, look, we don't really know what to make of this. We didn't actually see, this person you claim to have seen in your house. I'm sure there was somebody, but we didn't see them. And so for now, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor your property 24/7 and just see what happens, see if anybody comes in or out. We'll make sure nobody comes to this property, and we'll also begin an investigation in town to try to figure out, who this maniac was. And in the meantime, you and your girls go stay with a family friend or something. Just don't be here because we don't know what's going on here. And so Frank and his girls, they went and stayed with a family friend, and the police began their surveillance of the Bowen household. And for 2 days, nothing happened. Nobody went in or out of the Bowen household. And despite police canvassing the town and trying to figure out, who this maniac could have been, they really didn't get anywhere. Because remember, Frank's description and the girl's description of this maniac was, probably a man wearing a dress with clown makeup on. And so effectively, this person had a disguise on. There was nothing to go on. So they couldn't find anybody in town, there was no leads, and nobody has come to this house. And they're communicating with Frank Bowen the whole time. Basically, nothing's coming of this case. And so finally, 48 hours after, confronting this maniac in the closet, Frank and his girls, they've been at the family friend's house this whole time. And Frank's like, it'd be great to get my toiletries and a few other things from my house, because basically they evacuated their house and didn't get a chance to pack or anything. And Frank's thinking, nothing's going on at the house. There's no leads in this case. It's got to be safe to go back to my house for a minute and get the things I need. And so he tells his girls to stay with his family friend, and Frank, by himself, goes over to his house, and it's broad daylight, and he's expecting to find a police officer, who's monitoring his property, and he can tell the officer, hey, I'm just going in real quick to get my stuff, and they would, let him go in and do that. But when he got to his house, he looked around, and he didn't see any police officer outside the property watching the property. And he's thinking, that's pretty weird. They told me they've been watching my property 24/7, where are they? But Frank's like, that's weird, whatever. So he gets out of his car and begins walking towards his front door. But as he's walking, for a second, out of the corner of his eye, he can swear he can see somebody moving in the second floor of his house. But when he looked up, nobody was there. But he was certain somebody had been moving around up there. And Frank's thinking to himself, wait a minute. Are the police monitoring my house from the inside? Is that what they're doing? They've been in my house? I could have sworn they said they were out of my house. And Frank's like, what? Just in case, I need to call the police because I don't want to walk in there and startle an armed police officer who's basically looking for an intruder. And so Frank, he goes to that neighbor's house and uses their phone, and he calls the police, and he's like, hey, are you in my house? Is that what you guys have been doing? You've been monitoring my house from the inside? And they're like, no, we have been watching it from the outside. Very likely what's happened here is you've arrived at your house at the exact moment when there is turnover happening between the police officers who are watching it from the outside. Meaning the officer who's been watching your house must have just left, and the incoming officer who will be taking over the next shift is probably on their way, or maybe they're there right now. And in fact, what you should do, Frank, is hang up with us, go back to your property, and very likely the officer will be there or be there soon, and you can talk to them and have them search your house just in case to make sure nobody's in there. And so Frank says, okay, he hangs up the phone, he goes outside, and sure enough, now there is clearly a police officer in a car outside of his property. So Frank goes over and, explains the situation to the officer, and the officer's like, no one's going inside your property. Literally, we have watched this property 24/7, save for a couple of minutes here and there when we're doing turnover, but nobody's gone in or out of your property. But either way, Frank, I'll search your house just to be sure. And so Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and this officer goes up to Frank's door, he opens it up, he looks inside, and he can't believe what he's looking at. In the first floor of Frank's house, it's just madness. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor, and the furniture clearly has been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these sort of weird arrangements. And there are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and there are kitchen knives that have been driven into family photos on the wall. Like the knives are still sticking into the photo, and where these knives have been driven through the photo is always on a picture of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. And where there are knives in these pictures, above those pictures is written, I'm going to kill you, Tina, or I'm going to kill you, Karen. And so this officer obviously knows, we have a problem here. And so he backs out of the house, he calls for reinforcements, and so all these officers go in, guns drawn, now convinced, clearly somebody has found a way to come in and out of this house, or they're still here, and we have to find them. Like, clearly, the Bowens were not lying about this horrible, maniac that they encountered in the second floor of their house when police first showed up. Clearly, that must have happened, because they didn't do this, somebody else did, and they gotta be here. And so police, they tear the Bowen household apart, looking for this maniac. They look everywhere, and they can't find anybody. There's nobody in the house. And on top of that, it had snowed outside, and before they went in, they made sure they walked around the property to see if there were footsteps coming in or out of the property, and there wasn't. Like, it's not possible what they're seeing. But they've now torn the house up, looking for anything, and they found nothing. Other than, again, the madness they've seen with the furniture, the writing, the knives, that's all they've found. And so after hours and hours of this very frustrating search, a few of the officers found themselves in the basement, and they're just standing there talking to each other like, this is crazy. We must have missed something. Like, what is it? And at some point, one of those officers who was having that conversation, he had his hand resting on the washing machine, and he's just sitting there like, yeah, what did we miss? What did we miss? And suddenly, as he's leaning against the washing machine moved. And so suddenly there's this gap that's been created by moving the washing machine, and the officer looks at the wall where the machine had been sitting before, and clearly there is a hole on the wall. And the officer gets out his flashlight, and he looks in the wall and kind of scans down, and he sees there's this tunnel that's been burrowed in the wall of the basement, and it goes over to the corner, and looking back at this officer is Danny LaPlante. And he's crouched down, he's got a hatchet over his shoulder, he's wearing a dress, and he's staring back at this officer. I'm going to tell you about Danny LaPlante because this story takes a very dark turn. So, Danny LaPlante was 16 years old at the time he was pulled out of the wall. And 6 months prior to being pulled out of the Bowen household's wall, Danny had had this very brief interaction with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old. Apparently they went to school together or had some interaction in town, but Danny had sort of fallen in love or had some sort of romantic interest in Tina, and he felt like Tina had rejected him. Now, Tina did not remember any of this with Danny. This is entirely Danny's memory of what happened. But either way, 6 months earlier, when he had this sense of rejection from Tina, Danny responded to that by breaking into the Bowen household, cutting a hole in their walls, and burrowing tunnels in their walls. And for 6 months, Danny LaPlante lived in the Bowen household in their walls. Now, Danny was not able to access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could basically maneuver in the basement and partially into the first floor, but in order to get to the other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. And so routinely, over these 6 months that he was in their house, Danny would literally, while the family was home, just get out and wander through their house, like as the family is just living there, and they never noticed him. And so for 6 months, Danny spied on that family 24/7. And when the girls had that seance with the Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement in the walls watching, and he saw an opportunity. He thought, I'm going to pretend to be their mother and screw with them. And so when they heard that tapping sound, that was Danny pretending to be their mom. He was absolutely trying to get them to believe their mother was here. But then whenever Frank was around, Danny would stop the tapping and sort of let Frank believe the girls were making it up. And then gradually, Danny sort of transitioned from it's your mom and it's good to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night. He began sneaking out of the wall, going upstairs to the girls' bedroom, flicking the undersides of their beds, going in their closet, tapping in their closet, and then making sure to be hidden or escape before Frank came in. I mean, this is absolutely psychotic behavior, but it gets worse. So Danny is taken out of the walls and he's arrested, but then 10 months later, when he is awaiting trial, Danny is released on bail. And while he is on bail, he would sneak into another family's house in Massachusetts, the Gustafsons' house, and unfortunately, that family would not escape Danny. Danny would murder 3 members of that family for really no particular reason. He just picked a family and killed them. And so very likely, if Tina had not leapt out of the second floor window when Danny revealed himself in that dress with the hatchet and got them to go up to that bedroom, if Tina hadn't leapt out and if Frank hadn't held off the door like that, almost certainly Danny was corralling that family into that room to kill them with the hatchet. But Tina basically saved their lives. Danny LaPlante is still alive and he's serving multiple consecutive life sentences, and he actually recently was put up for parole. He didn't get it, he did not get parole, but during his hearing for his parole, when he was rejected, he was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates in the entire prison system.